Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
After a delay of many months, U.S. assistance to Ukraine is flowing again. However, Russian forces have been making gains in northeastern Ukraine, around Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, and there are persistent rumors of a larger Russian offensive to come. What is the situation on the ground now? Where is the war likely to head? And what does it all mean for the U.S.? To discuss these questions, I'm joined today on Chain Reaction by retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. General Hodges is the former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. He currently serves as NATO's senior mentor for logistics. He is also a distinguished fellow with GlobeSec in Slovakia and serves on the International Advisory Board of the New Strategy Center in Romania and the Warsaw Security Forum in Poland. He is co-author of the book Future War in the Defense of Europe, published by Oxford University Press. His combat assignments include commanding a brigade in the 101st Airborne Division in Operation Iraqi Freedom 2003 to 2004, serving as Chief of Operations for Multinational Corps Iraq in Operation Iraqi Freedom 2005-2006, and Director of Operations Regional Command South in Kandahar, Afghanistan, 2009-2010. General Hodges has also served in a variety of joint and Army staff positions, including Chief of Plans for the 2nd Infantry Division in the Republic of Korea, Director of the Pakistan-Afghanistan Coordination Cell on the Joint Staff, and Chief of Army Congressional Liaison. From 2012 to 2014, he served as Commander, NATO Allied Land Command in Izmir, Turkey. His last military assignment was as Commanding General, United States Army Europe in Wiesbaden, Germany, from 2014 to 2017. General Ben Hodges, thank you for joining me today on Chain Reaction.
Bob, thank you very much for the privilege.
So we're talking about Ukraine today, and there's a lot of Ukraine news, but one of the most recent pieces of Ukraine news is the fact that the U.S. and many other of Ukraine's Western partners have begun lifting restrictions on Ukraine using their weapons to strike inside of Russia. What do you think will be the effect of this decision, and why was it so long in coming?
Well, of course, it's welcome. I'm glad that the U.S. administration and other governments have made it clear that Ukraine can do what makes perfect military sense, and there's no legal or moral reason to have restricted Ukraine from using weapons to defend their citizens and to destroy Russian capabilities, even inside Russia. The problem is that there was even a policy to begin with like this that was so restrictive. But it reflects, unfortunately, the fact that our administration, the German government, and several other governments have not yet fully committed to helping Ukraine win. The priority for the administration seems to be escalation management. That's more important than anything else. And that's why you end up with bad policy decisions or policies that just don't make any sense, and they're not connected to an end state. If you have a clearly defined end state, which I think should be help Ukraine defeat Russia because it's in our strategic interest, then we would be providing them everything they need to defeat Russia, and we would not have these kind of restrictions. Now, to be fair, and to answer the second part of your question, the reason it took so long is because the White House does prioritize escalation management. And they have an excessive fear. I think it's excessive fear that Russia might actually use a nuclear weapon if an American provided ATACMS 300-kilometer range weapon was to destroy a target 300 kilometers inside of Russia, regardless of the type target. I think this fear is excessive, and it has caused us to be incremental and drip in our decision-making and in provision of aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, so you mentioned, the end state, right? And both of us as retired military officers sort of understand strategy as the relationship among ends, ways, and means, with an assessment of risk, right? And you talked about the risk of escalation that the White House has been so fixated on. But what is our end state in Ukraine? Your argument, I think, is our end state needs to be a Ukrainian victory. And sometimes we say that, but then sometimes we say put Ukraine in the best position for negotiation. So what do you think our actual end state for Ukraine is?
I think they don't know, or they're not willing to say it. Because if you say, here's our objective, which, by the way, for our civilian leaders is usually the hardest part, which is to clearly define the end state, then you have to commit to it. You have to put resources to it, and you have to accept the risk, understand and accept the risk, and you have to explain it to the population and to the Congress. That's hard. We didn't have it for 20 years in Afghanistan through multiple administrations. So as I look at what the administration has done and not done, said and not said, I think that they hope that this thing finally just sort of comes to where neither side can knock out the other, and they agree to some sort of settlement, and then they can move on to something else. So that's why they are focused on trying to manage Russia's reactions, which I think is naive as it can be, that you can't manage Russia. They only respect strength. You can deter them or you can defeat them, but you can't manage them. But somehow the administration thinks they can do that. Now, I do want to be clear. The administration has done a superb job on keeping 50 nations focused on helping Ukraine. They have delivered a lot, but this thing could have ended last year, I believe, if we had committed to helping Ukraine win. The administration's end state, I think, really is something that just kind of settles into, I don't want to say frozen conflict, but where Ukraine sort of finally gives in and to some sort of negotiated settlement. The problem, of course, that's exactly what the Kremlin hopes. The book on their living up to agreements is a very short book. They just don't do it unless they're absolutely forced to do it. And I think they're pretty confident that we won't force them to live up to any agreement because we haven't done it in the past 30, 40 years.
So you mentioned deterring Russia, and that sort of piqued my interest because I remember you and I were at a conference a couple of weeks ago in Bucharest, and you made the point, this is what deterrence failure looks like. So let's unpack that a little bit. So why did we fail to deter Russia in late 2021, early 2022? And then looking forward, this war will end at some point. How can Russia be deterred from rearming, re-equipping, and re-attacking Ukraine at some point in the future?
No, thanks for that. And that was a very good conference. I enjoyed being there with you in Bucharest. I think our failed deterrence really began back in 2008 when we did not do anything meaningful after Russia invaded Georgia. And you still have the Republic of Georgia, and you still have Russian troops occupying 20% of Georgia and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, places with which you're very familiar. And the Russians saw that we didn't have the will or mainly the will to do anything about it. And that's not just the U.S., that's the collective we. You'll remember that President Obama used the dreaded red line phrase, telling the Russians that if they helped the Assad regime use chemical weapons against the Syrian people, that would be a red line. And of course, they immediately did it, and we did nothing. That's we, the U.S., Germany, UK, or France. And then in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine using their proxies in Donbass and the seizure of Crimea and illegal annexation, the U.S. did nothing. Germany and France began this so-called Minsk process, but that was a joke. It was the kind of negotiations that the Russians love, where they kind of sit on the side. They sort of act like they're not really involved, but nobody else is willing or able to make any progress, and Russia feels no pain from it. They see that we are not willing to do what's necessary. So for them, that's 8 years since that happened, 2014 to 2022. In that span of 8 years, not only did any meaningful sanctions happen that would cause changes in behavior, Germany continued to build Nord Stream 2 all the way up to the end of 2021, which was a powerful signal to the Russians that Germany was not willing to really do anything meaningful. The rest of us, of course, we had the terrible ending to the Afghan campaign, which has several fathers for responsibility for that failure, but nonetheless, it happened, and the way it ended was a catastrophe. You have former President Trump talking about pulling the U.S. out of NATO. You have President Macron referring to NATO as brain dead. And then you had the chaos of January the 6th and the first non-peaceful transition of power in American history. So you can imagine in the Kremlin, they're looking at all this and they're saying the West is not going to do anything again. They might shake their fists, they might do a few more sanctions, but nothing that's going to have any real effect. And frankly, the Ukrainians also were not really ready. So that's what I mean by failed deterrence. They looked at all those things and felt confident that they could roll on into Ukraine and finish the job from 2014.
Yeah, it's funny. It's a great rundown of sort of everything that happened from 2008 through February of 2022, and we often forget. Like we don't connect those things in our minds. We see them as sort of discrete events. They form a pattern, right? A lot of the Russia crowd will say Russia is provoked more by weakness or irresolution than by resolve, and so that's the discussion I guess we can have later. But it is an interesting discussion because a lot of the people who are not Russia folks, have not studied Russia, are more worried about escalation than the people who have studied Russia, who were worried about escalation stemming from a lack of resolution or resolve on our part. So, but I do want to turn to, the recent aid package that the U.S. passed, $61 billion supplemental after many months of delay. What difference will that make in terms of Ukraine's military capabilities? Is there anything new in here, or is it just replenishing things that we have already given Ukraine?
I don't see that there was anything remarkable that's due, but it was, ammunition and some weapon systems. So really, it was a replenishment that should be enough to get them through towards the end of the year, if you will, along with what is finally beginning to show up from European allies. So I don't think we're going to see ammunition, particularly artillery ammunition, as a problem. And the reporting I see indicates that they seem to have quite a few ATACMS and other GMLRS rockets for use. That's encouraging. Of course, there still is a terrible shortage of air and missile defense capabilities. But this package should help Ukraine stabilize the situation. I don't see Russia having the ability to overrun or knock Ukraine out of the war. I don't see them having the ability to capture Kharkiv. They're able to keep killing innocent people there by launching glide bombs into the middle of the city. But in terms of actual maneuver and overwhelming Ukrainian defenders, I don't see it. The Russians, they may have a lot of people, but they're still not well trained. I just spoke this past weekend to a Ukrainian officer, a friend for many years, who said that they can feel that with successive Russian attacks, there's a decrease in the power of these Russian attacks. They don't have the same punch that they did previously. And I think this is a reflection of, impact on the Russian logistics systems. And also, when you don't have trained people and most of your officers and NCOs or leaders are dead, you're not going to have effective units. You can continue to push them as fodder into the fight and try to overwhelm defenders, but it just feels, according to him, they have less concern now than they may have had a few weeks ago.
That's an interesting point, the sort of lack of offensive punch, and at the risk maybe of diving down at the tactical level here, but just for a minute. I've been reading, a lot of what I've been reading about the Russian offensives driving in the direction of Kharkiv and then around Vovchansk have said that it has been mostly dismounted infantry assaults, not a lot of sort of BMPs, tanks, and things like that in the assault. Do you think that's an adaptation in tactics that the Russians think is more successful, or is it an indication of their lack of sort of logistical capability or lack of tracked vehicles, armored vehicle capability?
I think it's some of both. Clearly, we've been all watching for the last 2 years how tanks and armored vehicles that are not properly employed and not properly supported will be destroyed. And so there's been thousands of these armored vehicles that have been destroyed over the last couple of years. So you see more and more kind of bizarre Mad Max looking vehicles that are out there. even golf carts or quad, all-terrain vehicles, different things that they're trying to use. But I think it's also, when you don't have a trained army and you don't care about casualties, the whole point is to try and overwhelm Ukrainian defenders. So that's why I think you see a mix of ground assaults, bizarre vehicles, different things, trying to get close enough to the Ukrainian defenses to overwhelm them. Fortunately, now it looks like Ukraine is receiving enough artillery ammunition that they can not only destroy these attacks, but they can also, with effective counterfire, knock out Russian artillery that's necessary to support these ground attacks.
So I want to turn now to sort of theories of victory on both sides. What does the situation look like on the ground right now? And is either side able to make significant advances on the ground? And then how do you think each side defines victory? What do the Ukrainians realistically hope to achieve and that they can call a win? And then same thing for the Russians.
Well, I think for the Russians, their theory of victory is that the West quits, that they just continue to grind down Ukrainians, kill civilians, and hope that their threats of escalation will keep us from committing to helping Ukraine win. And of course, they know that the U.S. has an election coming up, that there are elections all over Europe this year, European as well as in the nations. So I think that they probably are watching the calendar as well in hopes that we will lose interest and not resume support after the U.S. election. I don't know that for a fact, but that's what it looks like, judging from their actions and knowing that there's not going to be another big package from the U.S. beyond what's already been done. There's not enough legislative time to do that. So I think for the Russians, they realize they cannot knock Ukraine out of the war. So for them, it's about attrition. On the other hand, I think the Russians have mortgaged their future in order to do what they're doing now. I don't believe that they can sustain what they're doing now through the end of next year. So, I mean, they're on the clock, if you will, in terms of manpower and industry. I mean, just imagine if we were really serious about helping Ukraine win. We had isolated Russia from China and Iran in such a way that Russia could not receive any sort of the drones or parts or that sort of thing, that their defense industry would be on its knees right now. So I think for the Ukrainians, it is to stay in the fight, number one. Number two, I think this year they're going to focus on stabilizing the front, make sure that there's not any sort of big breakthrough or something that changes the momentum. I think they've got to use this year to grow the size of the army, to create some additional combat units so that they can rotate forces, get them out of the fight, allow for retraining, reconstitution, all of the stuff that we all know. When you're in sustained land combat, you have to be able to reconstitute, and they haven't had much chance to do that yet. And reconstitution also includes retraining, integrating new equipment, making sure that what they've learned about fighting against Russian electronic warfare, for example, that is incorporated into their fighting capabilities. I think that this is also the year of industrial competition, that the West we're finally getting going on ammunition production, on weapons production, and the Ukrainians also trying to rebuild or reestablish some of their own defense industry. So there's an industrial competition that's underway here as well. And I think that's really what this year is about. My sense is that Ukrainians are getting better and better and better on their long-range drone program. And the Black Sea Fleet is, in my view, it seems they're not even really a factor anymore. So I'm bullish on Ukraine.
So let me ask you, as a retired U.S. Army senior leader, what are the lessons that Western militaries can be learning from this war? I mean, we're watching it very closely. I sometimes feel that the U.S. Army is serious about understanding what's happening and drawing lessons, and other times I feel like we're a little dismissive. I've heard senior leaders say, well, these are two second-rate armies. We would never fight that way. I think that's It always makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I hear that, because the Russians didn't expect to fight that way either. What can we learn from what we're watching happen in Ukraine?
Number one, we better get Ukraine into NATO as fast as possible. I mean, this is the best army on the continent of Europe, and we'll be lucky to have them as allies eventually. So that's whenever I hear somebody say, well, like what you just repeated, that, well, we would never do that. That kind of arrogance, is what cost us dearly in Iraq and Afghanistan and in other wars as well. So I hope that's not a widely held opinion. Now, having said that, it is true that we would never send American soldiers into an attack without having achieved air superiority. And it's astounding to me that the Russians, with a huge advantage in air power, failed to achieve air superiority. They've also failed job two, which is to cut the lines of communication. They have not interdicted any convoys or trains bringing weapons and ammunition from Poland and Ukraine. That's incredible to me. But that's a reflection of failure of job one. They didn't get air superiority, and they don't have the culture they don't do what our great Air Force does, which is practice all of these things. Air superiority is not about numerical superiority. It's about destroying the enemy's air defense, the enemy's command and control, the enemy's logistics for their Air Force, and then you can start knocking airplanes down. They never thought they'd have to do that, and they had no experience doing it. That's flying over Syria was a completely different thing for them. So I think that the 3 or 4 biggest takeaways for me are air and missile defense. I've always been worried that we don't have enough, and when I look at the volume of rockets and missiles and drones that Russia launches against civilian targets in Ukraine, we are not prepared for that in Central and Western Europe. We could not protect all of the key cities, the seaports, the airports, transportation infrastructure that's needed for NATO rapid reinforcement. We absolutely don't have enough to be able to do that. So that's number one. And if the Russians have already made the decision, or when they make that decision to attack a NATO country, they will have already made the decision to launch missile strikes against our transportation infrastructure. So we've got to fix that. Number two, I think that everybody's got drones now, and everybody thinks about drones. That's a good thing. And I know that the Army has been working on a counter drone program for quite some time. And I imagine that there's a lot of progress being made. I just don't know the full extent of it. But that's clearly something that's got to be done. Our great Navy has been working on maritime unmanned systems for a while. I think it's actually a pretty extensive program. And we have seen the success that the Ukrainians had against the Russian Black Sea Fleet with their maritime unmanned systems. So I would expect that the Navy is paying close attention to that. But I would also say that our understanding of logistics has changed now as a result of what we've seen. Just the sheer volume of ammunition, the volume of casualties. What you and I grew up with, the concept of fixed forward. You want to repair equipment as far forward as possible so you get it back in the fight. Well, that means you have to have mechanics and armored, recovery vehicles and all. You got to get the parts up there so that you can fix things that have been damaged or need maintenance. That's probably not something that we've practiced a whole lot lately that we'll have to relearn. But finally, more important than anything that I just said is the reminder of the importance of well-trained, fit, tough, disciplined women and men in your formations with good leadership at the sergeant and junior officer level. Almost every video I've seen of a tank or a BTR or a convoy getting blown apart or troops getting hit, they were in the open, not properly protected, not practicing the good field craft that's needed. And so you have to have mean NCOs that make you do the right stuff. And so I think we want to make sure we continue to invest in our leaders so that we have these good sergeants and good captains and majors that can operate effectively in these terrible conditions.
I guess last question, and that is, what's at stake for the U.S. here in this war? What would a decisive Russian victory or a decisive Ukrainian victory mean for us?
Failure of Ukraine will have devastating consequences for Europe and for the United States. If Ukraine fails, Russia will absorb tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops into their ranks. They'll be forced into the service, and then they'll be used as cannon fodder on the next phase of what Russia attempts, most likely against Moldova or against Lithuania or maybe even Poland. And the Romanians have said that they will protect Moldova. So that means you got a NATO country that will now be involved. The Poles are not going to sit behind the Vistula River and watch the Red Army come closer and closer. So in fact, they would most likely, my estimate, move into Western Ukraine. So now you've got another NATO ally that's going to be involved. And so the consequence of Ukrainian failure is that NATO will end up being in this fight. And then, of course, there's millions of Ukrainian refugees that will be heading into Central and Western Europe, which will add to the already disruptive effect of millions of refugees, not to mention the continued disruption of food shipments and energy and oil shipments out of the region. So there's a lot of negative human consequences, strategic consequences, economic consequences if Ukraine fails. So the best way to keep NATO out of a conflict with Russia is to make sure that Ukraine wins, to help them defeat Russia inside Ukraine. I think that for Americans, when people say, why do we care about Ukraine? Well, it's about keeping NATO out of it, helping Ukraine win so that NATO doesn't get involved. American soldiers are not on the ground involved there, but also our own economic interests. America's economic prosperity is tied directly to the prosperity of our biggest trading partner, Europe. And so if you've got refugees and disruption to energy and food, that affects the United States. It affects our prosperity. So from a purely selfish, practical standpoint, it's to our benefit that Ukraine defeats Russia. And then finally, China. The Chinese are watching to see, are we serious about what we say when it comes to freedom of navigation, respect for sovereignty, respect for international law, all the things that make up the so-called international rules-based order that are under attack now by Russia, and which China also threatens. And so the Chinese see that we don't have the political will or the industrial capacity or the military capability to deal with it in Europe, where it's much simpler due to the geography than it will be in the Indo-Pacific region. Then I don't think they'll be too impressed with anything we say about Taiwan or the Philippines or the South China Sea.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. So I really like the way you ended. You started with sort of the power, material, security, and economic interests, and then you went to the principle, right? There are principles, at least we claim there are in the United States, principles that govern international relations. There are norms, rules, and laws that ought to be respected. But it sort of takes me back to, George Bush Sr. on the White House lawn in August of 1990, this will not stand, right? This aggression against Kuwait will not stand after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. That war was at least as much about principle as power. And I think you're absolutely right that this one is too. There are principles at stake here that if we mortgage them or if we ignore them, will eventually cause us to have to fight Russia in some other, probably more direct way at some other time. And many of the people who watch Russia routinely have said that. What should we be looking for going forward in Ukraine?
I think people still wait to see what happens in the United States. I encounter this every day here in Germany or Romania or Finland and other Poland. These are the different countries, where I spend a lot of time in the various jobs work that I do. Everywhere, people want to know, well, who's going to win the election? What's going to happen? What if it's Trump? And the point is, America still is the country that people look up to. Nobody thinks that the United States is perfect. They know there's always a degree of chaos in our politics, going back to the very beginning. But they always have high expectations that we will stand up for what's right. And they always have these high expectations that something about our system and the resilience of our people, that we can absorb a lot of damage and still generally get it right. That was the design and the nature of Americans. And I say that not in a, boasting or arrogant way, but I mean, it is kind of who we are. It's the reason tens of thousands of people try to get here all the time. But there's no given that it's going to stay that way. It requires positive leadership. It requires commitment at every level by our population and by our leaders to make the hard decisions to be a role model, but also to build and protect relationships with other countries, allies that share our values. Biggest defense budget in the history of the world is not enough if you don't have allies. We just don't have enough capacity to do everything we need to do. We need allies. And so part of maintaining a strong alliance like NATO or the relationship we have with countries out in the Indo-Pacific region is based on confidence and trust in those shared values. And I think, if we don't protect those, then it doesn't matter how many F-35s or submarines or tanks we have, we will be alone.
Yeah, that's a great point about allies too, right? I mean, the two Winston Churchill quotes come to mind. He said about allies, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And that's one big advantage we have over China and Russia, is that we have a large network of alliances that bring a whole lot of capability and a lot of legitimacy to what we do. The other Winston Churchill quote that popped into my head as you were talking about sort of the fact that we're imperfect, we make mistakes, was in World War II, he said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted the alternatives.
Every alternative.
Yeah.
A lot of accuracy in that.
Yeah, he was perceptive. Well, General Hodges, thank you so much for joining me on Chain Reaction today. I hope we can do this again soon.
Thanks again for the privilege.
Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.